Tonight we welcome Gouldsboro Historical Society's author and historian and frequent contributor to our program. This is his 7th presentation for the Society. Allen Workman will recount the early development of the fish factory in Prospect Harbor. Since Allen has become a part of our Gouldsboro Historical Society family, he has proven to be an invaluable resource for his historical research and knowledge. And the Gouldsboro Historical Society is very fortunate to have Allen as an active and contributing member. So now I'll turn it over to Allen Workman for the fish factory in Prospect.
That's a lot to listen to, Ken. All right. Special thanks tonight to Dick Fisher and Warren Cove Enterprises for promoting us for the evening. There's been a fish factory in Prospect Harbor for 150 years. That's a long time. It's long enough to give a distinctive character to this part of Gouldsboro. So we're here to look at the role the factory has played here and in our state over a very long time, a period of the stretch of the town's history. This won't be an inside view of factory life, as I never did work in the factory myself. As a kid, I did load herring from 2 or 3 factories, as well as from seiners and wares, while hauling the bait that supplied fishing wharfs. But mostly I've had to rely on what other people have told me about factory life, such as it seems that working in the factory's superheated cooking retort wasn't so comfortable on a hot August day. But let's hope we might hear from people, from anyone who did work in this factory. But you can actually hear from some of them in this video, which is in the Dorcas Library. It's called Everybody Had Their Own Rhythm. It's an oral history interview done by the University of Maine Oral History Unit. And you can get it, and you'll hear from several of the workers done in 2010 when the factory closed for the last time at the sardine factory. But for now, we'll take a longer view. We might look for some broader trends like the constant interchange between our local effort and our local resources used to build this industry versus the recurrent need for technology, money, and marketing and originating from away. Or the cyclic pattern, the rise and fall of decades-long fish factory development and decline. Or the long-range changes in the fish density and behavior that affected the canning industries. So, let's go. Next. So Down East fishermen's biggest challenge over the years, beyond the dangers of working at sea, has been getting their perishable fish to a faraway and distant market. Before the Civil War era, the mainstay answer had been salted cod and mackerel, dried and shipped in, along with some smoked herring. But after the Civil War, the emerging new technology in food canning changed everything. The prime main seafood that everyone wanted, sealed up in preserved form if you couldn't get it fresh, was of course lobster. In canned form, the lobster was generally sold as a luxury item, as in these early can labels from Portland. If you could read the label print on this can of Star brand Paris Exposition lobster, you'd notice that it's in English and French. L'homard à l'étoile, very classy. But developed with soldered ends. And this, like most in the Civil War era, could be pretty hard to open. How'd you like to open this with a bayonet? Soon there were can openers that buyers could easily use to open, and it quickly became possible to market preserved seafoods worldwide. A main industry was created in the 1860s with lobster meat, at first in Portland from the Burnham and Merrill Company. That's the B&M guys from Baked Bean fame. And then especially from the Portland Packing Company. That company, looking to expand eastward, connected in 1869 with a local entrepreneurial family, Hiram D. Coombs and his son-in-law, right here in Prospect Harbor. Coombs was apparently already exploring lobster preservation with warehouse stock using heavy cooking gear. And as the Portland Company was looking to expand eastward, they were ready to make a deal with Coombs. This is very tricky. Thank you. So in 1870, Hiram Coombs leased shore property at the harbor's south end, once called Clark Cove and formerly Whale Cove from earliest onshore whaling. And there he built the village's first fish factory, using the Portland Packing Company's funds. And it might have looked like this, which is actually in Newfoundland. Portland Company also had a small lobster factory built at Stave Island here, but that was soon folded into the Prospect Harbor operation, and all under the management of Hiram Coombs and his son-in-law, D. Alfred Hamilton. The new factory processed the catch of local lobstermen who, at this stage, were mostly fishing inshore from simple one-man dories, like this one, and skiffs. And they were just starting to use those net-headed traps with wooden lasts that persisted way up into the 1980s. And it was the independent schooner or boat captains who called on the outlying harbors to purchase from fishermen carrying the catch over to sell at the cannery. It was a seasonal business, factory operating with the mostly hard-shell catch from late spring into mid-July. A typical plant like this seems to have employed about 25 men, women, and children, the men doing the first boiling and breaking down the lobster tails and claws, and as these guys appear to be doing, and the women pack the meat from the parts, packing it into cans, which men then soldered closed with the cans boiling for 2 hours to preserve them. A late inventory of the Coombs equipment, as accounted for by the Portland Company, gives us a detailed list of the tools they used for the building. Some vessels here, 2 schooners, a small boat, and so on, packing machines, 9 meat pans, weighing boxes, gear, not exactly high-tech equipment. But we do have this list from that era. The packing technique was less than perfect, as it failed to protect against the threat of bacteria, knowledge of which was unknown at the time. Too often, the result was a portion of the pack emerging from the can spoiled, known in the trade as black lobster. But bigger problems faced the lobster canning business. Even though it had thrived all through the 1870s and into the 80s, it was starting to have bigger problems. Rapidly growing resorts and cities were now consuming all of the large fresh lobsters that fishermen could sell. Carry them to market and sleep lobster, smacks like this one. Canneries were now competitors for the lobster catch, both adult as well as the juvenile lobsters, which were now most of what the factories could get. Thus, canneries seem to be draining and threatening a rapidly dwindling supply of lobsters, or so the growing fleet of lobster fishermen claimed. Fishermen soon pressured state representatives to make a series of laws restricting plant operations so that by 1888, the smaller sized lobsters that factories were using almost exclusively became outlawed as illegal. And thus, in 1889, Maine's lobster canneries were squeezed out of Maine, some moving to Canada. The Portland Company's plant in Prospect Harbor died a slow death. In Prospect Harbor, what was left of the Portland Company's site was bought by the late Hiram Coombs' son-in-law, Alfred Hamilton. He began making plans for a different canning operation and a new fishery, the canning of herring sardines, which had been launched a decade earlier in Eastport. Once a luxury item, like lobster, sardines with new canning technology were becoming an item of everyday consumption and a prosperous industry for Maine. So, Gouldsboro's first sardine factory was born in 1889, owned and operated by Alfred Hamilton. Alfred Hamilton took advantage of the abandoned wharf and lobster plant site, making a bargain investment, perhaps with his own resources, and set up the sardine cannery, wharf, and buildings. Our only image of this plant is in this photo of about 1893, showing the buildings on a factory wharf in much the same location as it is today, and a crew of men at the wharf and women are ready to unload herring from the local sailors' carryboat sloops. This photo seems to show a turnout of about 30 workers, perhaps most of the crew of the first sardine factory, with the women packers on the right. So the sardine industry was long based on small-sized Atlantic herring, fished as they schooled during the late spring and summer along shore, flowing into coves and around islands, feeding on diatom zooplankton, krill, fish larvae. The natural cycle of herring feeding inshore meant that the cannery would be a summer seasonal industry, largely dependent on continually abundant schools of juvenile herring of an average 6 to 7 inch size. The inshore juvenile herring were caught in the fish trap or weir. Let's see if this thing will actually show us. Yeah. Is there a light? Oh, God. Is there a light? There. Okay. Its nets fastened to poles and driven into the bottom and forming a circular corral with a deflecting fence here to direct the fish into the trap as they swam along shore. Much the same pattern was used with seines, like this one in Korea. Portable nets with floats and sinkers strung out with a small craft in a circular pattern to form a seine fish trap, usually with a gate net to shut off the fish. So seining operations proliferated often between islands and shores where herring might be channeled into the trap. Weirs and seines were common off of Korea, near Outer Bar Island, near Squeak on the One-Squeak shore, where its nets were kept in that wharf house that's there at One-Squeak Harbor, and on the Frenchman Bay area near Stave Island. The inset shows this is a contract from a weir owner, somebody who actually put up the weir owns it. He's selling short-term rights to the Stinson family to seine fish in the late 1890s. A fisherman with a full trap summoned a carryboat to net the herring into its hole for transport to the wharf. It was an amazing sight to see the fish explode out of the water in a cloud of flying scales and as they were hauled into the boat's net. And I have to say, watching this as a kid, it absolutely blew me away. It was like a thunderclap. What happened? There, that blew me away. Okay. All right. Inside the factory. The men and women proceeded somewhat as they had with lobsters. The men and boys shifting, sorting, and drying the fish. Child labor, you can see some kids there, in early 1900s factories became controversial later on, and apparently in places it still is controversial. Okay. The women cut off the heads and tails and packed fish into cans, whose lids again needed soldering with molten lead to seal off the cans for boiling in ovens. And it was estimated that a plant could produce about 650 cans daily by this somewhat cumbersome process. Yet the process continued to have its problems. The soldering of cans with molten lead and then the boiling of sealed cans required puncturing the lids to let off steam. And the holes then had to be filled with a drop of solder to seal off the cooked down can. The fumes of molten lead are said to have filled the air. This cumbersome process proved an unreliable technology for sealing and killing bacteria, resulting in customers with too many swollen and spoiled cans. Alfred Hamilton unfortunately discovered this when his produce routinely was sent for distribution to the market with a Boston canner, E.T. Russell Company. In 1895, Russell the Bostonian wrote to him. He said, "It does seem as if we should never see the last of the rejection of the sardines that you packed last season. Only this morning we have 50 cases returned to us from one party and 17 from another, and that 17 cases is utterly worthless." So in response, Hamilton in 1900 sought out the latest technology for testing his cans and trying to improve it, but it was almost too late. The new knowledge of bacteria in 1900 was just beginning to reveal that the produce must be heated to 295 degrees to ensure safety. And it was not until 1904 that a machine for a double-seamed sanitary can was developed for proper sealing. Many canning workers generally were slow to accept this technology, as the highly trained, skilled men who soldered the lids onto the cans resisted a process that would eliminate their fairly highly paid work. By 1900, the sardine canning industry was at the high water mark of its expansion. One syndicate, the Seacoast Packing Company, owned 60 plants extending from the Quoddy region to Millbridge. The Hamilton Sardine Factory was not the only one in the Scudic region either. Not far away, a new sardine factory opened, at this time in South Gouldsboro, the Frenchman Bay Packing Company, built by A.B. Holt, which ran until about 1920. However, at this point, Alfred Hamilton was evidently forced to a decision. Either likely the demands and costs of keeping up with the new tanning technology had become prohibitively expensive, and raising funds locally seemed less promising to him than his real estate interests. So in 1904, he turned to the Boston company that had been doing the sales distribution for his produce. His 15-year operation was sold to Edward Russell of Boston, along with a careful survey and rights to a critical local water supply uphill from the plant. The E.T. Russell Company was already well established in the sardine cannery business, with plants at Rockland and a big one in Southwest Harbor. Russell, with his plant manager Clarence Mitchell, had the capital, the new double sealing canning machines, and the resources to expand the business. And he aimed to make Prospect Harbor the center of his operation. This image seems to show that the Russell built up on the factory that Russell built on the fourth site of Hamilton's plant, with tracking in the foreground on an adjacent wharf, perhaps near the site of today's Town Landing Wharf. Then in 1908, Russell dismantled his big Southwest Harbor plant and managed to get it floated by barge over the water to Prospect Harbor for installation on that adjacent pier. So here's this other plant here. Original one, new, second one. With this expanded operation, Russell now had two factories, which kept Prospect Harbor busy for 15 more years. The new company owned its own carry boat fleet, a schooner plus a steamboat and a motorized vessel, which had a renowned one-armed captain skilled at buying herring from ware fishermen. None of those on view here are those carry boats. These are showed the sailing sloop boats that many lobstermen still used in the early 1900s. Using modern technology, Russell developed a successful run of sardine production. The Historical Society has these photos of its crews, men and women, packers, and of the managing partner, Mr. Gallagher, and plus an interesting memoir from a plant engineer describing the canning process of this era, much as we've just shown it. So here are the men. The renovated business boomed, along with all the sardine packers along the coast, especially during World War I, when efficient food production and demand was at a premium. Unfortunately, as soon as the war ended, prices plummeted as demand slacked off dramatically, and Russell was caught unprepared. He found his operation and credit so badly overextended with unsaleable capacity that he was unable to undertake operations in the 1920 season. Though he desperately hoped to reopen if prices and finances came through, his luck had run out. Because today's Chapter 11 bankruptcy laws were far in the future, Russell's 1921 hopeless attempt to continue operating while honoring creditors produced a landmark law case, which he lost. The machinery was idle and the property left with the Boston holding company, the Prospect Harbor Canning Company, in hope of better times and a new buyer. It appears that the Boston company may have hired an experienced factory man in Southwest Harbor, Jonas Wass, owner of the Addison Company, to continue operating part of the abandoned factory. And, as it turned out, the new buyers were not from away, but local Mainers in town who managed to take advantage of the financial downturn and revive the factory with local resources. About this time, the Stinson family of Gouldsboro decided to take an interest in the plant. The father, John Stinson, had an extensive holding in Hancock as a lobster dealer, while his son Calvin, who once worked at the Russell plant, had just returned from World War I looking for business opportunities. The photo shows a gathering of young men near the factory in what became Bide Moore's store in the early 1900s, and in the center of the trio is, with folded arms, young Calvin Stinson. Years later, his father, John Stinson, had a long career as a lobster dealer dating from the old days of buying and transporting in a schooner lobster smack like this one. And while years later, the older Cal Stinson here is boasting about that part of his heritage. John Stinson mobilized his resources, and in 1925 he purchased one of those 2 sardine plants in his own name with Calvin. So father and son together managed their own startup in half of the old factory. 2 years later, they cobbled together funds to buy the other half, perhaps the portion that had been operated by Jonas west of Southwest Harbor, and within a few months, Wass had merged with the Stinsons to form a partnership, the Wass and Stinson Canning Company. So here, the 2 parts of the old plant are now operating in the partnership. Most of the assets were jointly held, with Wass holding a slight edge in shares, while the partnership operated jointly for a time, Wass focusing on his Southwest Harbor plant, while the Stinson clawed their way to build the Prospect Harbor plant. During this time, the Stinsons sold and mortgaged nearly all of their family assets. They went into debts. They sold 2 houses on the plant property. They ran into tax problems. One of the houses stayed on site on a 1/4-acre lot that became the Pink House. And the other was hauled uphill by the Lowell factory, and I believe it's still there on the top of the hill. The Southwest Harbor plant, the renewed Prospect Harbor plant now produced and sold lots of sardines, enough despite the growing national depression to enable the Stinsons actually to buy a controlling interest in Wass's Southwest Harbor plant by 1931. This is it in Southwest Harbor. So the Stinson family now had 2 plants in operation. Here's the Southwest plant workers about this era, in what was still called the Addison Canning Company, named for Mr. Wass's hometown, but controlled now by the Stinsons. Now, in 1934, the Stinson operation, not for the first or last time, caught a big break with the unpredictable annual cycle of those herring migrations temporarily changing. That year, the vast schools of fish abandoning the usual herring-rich Quoddy area and its big factories shifted their migratory feeding into the Schoodic and Frenchman Bay region. This gave Stinson factories a big competitive bump just when they needed it. 5 years later, Calvin, having inherited from his late father, got another break with a large U.S. government contract to supply sardine rations to the Navy Seabees operation, the beginning of an era of prosperity that would continue with a surge of production during World War II. We're especially fortunate to have a record of these wartime days of plant expansion in the 1940s and into the 50s, based on an oral history interview done with Calvin Stinson's son, Charlie. It was recorded and transcribed much later, at the time the plant was later sold, and Charlie was 81 years old. He recalled how the factory was already diversifying its packing to process more than herring. He said, during the war, in the sardine plant, we took a piece of that original plant and we processed mussels. We used to go down to the shore and buy mussels, go down and pick them up in the truck, bring them back and process them. And we sold a lot of them during the war and to the government to serve the military people and different things. And that went on for quite a few years. Charlie Stinson vividly described some of the wear and seine operations for trapping herring. He's, quote, they would guide them into the weir in there, and they'd pull the mouth of the net up so that they, what they call, pursed them up. They'd make a circle around them, and they'd purse them there, and then they'd have a couple of doors inside. And then when he got it up over the hold of the boat, he let the handle go, and the net would open up, and the fish into the net, and the fish into the net and in the weir. They'd hoist the boat, hoist the back up again, and that's how they did it. They loaded the boat. he described some of the seining. There's a big reel. What do we got? Do I have that? The big reel. Is that next? There. In fact, yes, I should have been showing you all that for the seining. And there's the big reel for a weir or seine. And hauling some of the fish out of the weir or seine, especially at night, said Charlie. Sometimes, during the time of the year that they get what they called fire water, you could see them flying in the water. They'd boil the water. You'd see fire in the water. They'd do that late at night, and we'd watch them, and it was interesting, but it was hard work. You'd pull those nets all by hand, all of them. They'd have a crew probably. From the stop seiners, they'd probably be probably 6 or at least 6 or 8 people crew to pull the nets in. A lot of work to it. It was the same in the weir. It was all done by hand. It was hard work. And then they used to bail them out with a net. The boat did. And I don't remember the exact year when they got rid of the net. Started using fish pumps. When they started using fish pumps, the quality wasn't quite so good because they took all the scales off the fish. In later years, with those fish pumps, those flying scales were separated deliberately and used to make glossy cosmetics. As the newly loaded sardine carrier was en route to the factory, the captain would radio ahead. Said Charlie. A lot of times they'd say, well, I'm half loaded, but within an hour I'll be loaded. And they'd tell the factory plant manager that, and then he'd get the crew there before the boat got there. Someone would say, here comes some fish. Well, then the guy in the boiler room, he'd blow the whistle so many times you could hear it from here to Winter Harbor. And they'd have a big, huge steam whistle. Well, they'd blow it 8 times for packers, so packers would all get ready, and they'd go, and then they used to have buses to go pick them up. They used to drive around town everywhere, pick them up, the buses. As for me, I still think I hear that factory whistle every time I hear the town's noon whistle today. I'm a little surprised that Charlie never mentioned the Piper Cub spotter airplanes used by many factories in this era, as he himself was a pilot. They often flew in twilight hours when schools of fish could be seen more easily by air. The pilot sometimes hovering over the seine operations, radioing or even hand gesturing to trap and close off the fish. Or, with one pilot that I read about, actually hanging out of the plane's cabin door, shouting instructions and negotiating prices. Inside the factory, a long process of sorting the herring sardines and cooking them on flake racks was followed by drying and conveying the sardines to the packers, said Charlie. And then they'd take them out, and the guy would put them on the conveyor, and the girls would take them off. There'd be 2 girls to a table. They'd take them off and they'd pack them, and they'd pack them cooked back then. After cutting off the heads and tails with scissors, the women would put them in a can, and then they put them on these trays, and when they got so many trays, like there's 25 cans in a tray, and when they get 4 of them, there would be a case, and they'd get paid by the case, so much a case, piecework. And when they got so many piled up, the guy come along and placed them up and punched the card and said they got a case and showed how many they got. Some of them, they got 31, 32 cases during the day. A good, smart, fast pack of wood. And I actually knew one of them. All through World War II and into the 50s, the Stinson plants worked the sardine herring this way as well as mussels. A factory in South Gouldsboro, Snows, busily packed clams during these same years. Although Calvin tried to claim the U.S. government's wartime pricing was inadequate, Still, he and the other Down East plants all had to accept the price, and that made them exceptionally profitable during the World War II era. After the war, Calvin built himself a brand new house, which still stands today overlooking the factory. In 1945, the factory got an unexpected facelift when a big hurricane took out many of the portions of the old Russell plant. But the whole operation got quickly rebuilt into a more efficient configuration. In fact, this was a turning point. Almost immediately after the war, Calvin Stinson embarked on the first stage of a rapid expansion. Most dramatically, he launched a huge program of new acquisitions in the mid-1950s, seemingly plowing back every penny of wartime earnings and somehow to raise funds. So a lot of expansion happened in this 20-year post-war period. Calvin enlarged his home fleet of family-named classic sardine carrier boats. Here's the item A, please, named for his daughter. And the Eve Grace was another one. And they developed a fleet of trucks, improved his processes with fish pumps, and they soon bought the equipment to make his own can-producing facility. Of course, Calvin already had the Southwest Harbor Addison canning plant, soon renamed, expanded, and improved. When it closed years later in the 1980s, that site in time became the big Dysart wharf that dominates Southwest Harbor today. Maybe you can kind of recognize it. This is, where you see all those schooners and stuff, that wharf right out in the middle of Southwest. So this is the plant as it looked back then. His first step in new acquisitions was in Bath, pursuing a familiar pattern by forming another partnership with a plant owner in that region. That deal eventually was bought out to become one of the longest running plants in the company, even after Stinson gave up the ownership. When the abandoned Bath factory was burned in the early 2000s, it became the focus of a controversial and unsuccessful harbor development project. However, the biggest leap forward for Stinson in the early 1950s was a coup takeover of what remained of the biggest canning conglomerate in Maine, known as the Syndicate, or the Seaboard Packing Company, a grouping of several plants on the coast, mostly in the Quoddy region. The company was apparently spread too thin, and following the boom production years of World War II, had badly overstretched its finances, somewhat as Russell had done in Prospect Harbor after the previous war. Stinson seems to have had a plan behind his acquisitions to consolidate factory operations down east to achieve maximum efficiency. It was a corporate takeover in a pattern now familiar to us from the 1980s and 90s, disassembling a new acquisition to make all its parts combined and more valuable somewhere else. By disassembling many of the old seaboard factories, especially in Lubec and Robbinston, as well as in South Portland, by shipping their equipment to plants in Eastport, and especially to Prospect Harbor, and by setting up a subsidiary plant under a new manager in Eastport, Stinson did achieve industry consolidation. But a lot of factory workers in the Quoddy region were put out of work. Calvin Stinson's name was not so popular way down east. Let us leave it to business historians or analysts to uncover what sort of financial jugglery the Stinson Company managed in order to fund all of this. There's evidence of some maneuvering with tax liability in the mid to late 40s, and both the federal and local liens, and he seemed to be running a tab to postpone local taxes due so as to mobilize his funds when he needed, but it was altogether a great business success. Another major part of achieving efficiency in the late 50s and early 60s was buying a branch of the American Can Company and setting up sardine can manufacturing facility right in Prospect Harbor, producing aluminum cans for all the Stinson factories and all other plants as well. So by the mid-1960s, Stinson had even more plants in Rockland and Yarmouth with a diversity of fish processing beyond sardines. To oversee these and varied fish factories, Calvin's son Charlie was sent to coordinate the operating process. Here's how Charlie saw the process evolving. I think it was 10 plants we owned at one time. We had one in Robinson, 2 in Lubeck, 1 in Machiasport, 1 here, Southwest Harbor, Bass Harbor, Belfast, Bath, Portland, South Portland. We had plants. So we used to pack a lot of fish at one time, and it seems time, like everything, time went on, and you got modernized, and you have more efficient ways of doing things, and then you start eliminating plants gradually, one at a time. And that's where we end up doing a lot of trucking. At this point of expansion in Prospect Harbor, this plant suffered a major fire, as reported by the Ellsworth American on May 9th, 1968. It destroyed almost all of it. While the company had enough resources to rebuild immediately, this was another turning point for Stinson's career in the industry, committed as the company was to consolidation and efficient production. However, because of the coast-wide and continuing severe decline in the spring and summer schooling runs of herring, small-sized herring suited for traditional canning, many major sardine companies and canners saw the 1970s as a right time to withdraw from the business. One of the very biggest, the Underwood Company in Bass Harbor, decided to quit the sardine business entirely and shut down the plant. But for the Stinsons, the future lay in intense consolidation, looking in new directions for more diverse kinds of herring and other seafood species, using more efficiently automated equipment in centralized plants, and seeking new channels and a new process to get steadier supplies of fish. This meant more equipment, more ships, trucks, and for a time, steadier employment in the factory towns. In Prospect Harbor, as the burnt factory was rebuilt at a cost of $500,000, new equipment from Norway was established that radically changed the canning process and began an international connection that resonated ever since. The new machines sorted and cut off heads and tails, leaving women to pack raw fish that would then be cooked in the cans. Here and elsewhere, the factory started packing winter shrimp as well as shellfish. So here's the rebuilt factory. The biggest development in searching out a steadier fish supply was the emerging technology of freezing a catch caught off New England shores or in faraway seas. This involved great big freezer ships capable of bringing a large supply of fish to the factories. Russian abuse of this process in the 1970s gave rise to our international 200-mile territorial limits. Frozen herring gradually surpassed fresh-caught fish as a way of keeping the factory busy for longer hours. For Stinson, this meant bigger ships for freezing fish caught at sea, such as this vessel, the Calvin L. Stinson, built in 1980, typical of several designed for offshore fishing and eventually for importing fish from overseas in Scandinavia and Ireland. Charlie Stinson, often in charge of buying fish from overseas, described the process this way. We spent a month in Ireland and hooked up to buy fish from over there, frozen fish. I know I bought thousands of tons over there every year. I'd probably buy 4,000 tons, metric tons, put in a big freezer ship, and go to Winterport with it. They had a big cold storage freezer up there where we kept them. We had frozen what they called cured herring. They cured them in barrels. Did a lot of that down here in Prospect Harbor and in 2 or 3 other plants. Well, by the 70s and 80s, the small-sized traditional sardine herring were seldom running along shore as they once had done in huge schools. But the canneries were still eager to find fresh-caught fish from the Gulf of Maine. Herring could now be found farther offshore in the Gulf of Maine, and more often found in the larger sizes, up to 10 inches or more, which were the size for spawning. These are the spawning areas. The large trawlers were often fishing offshore or in near traditional spawning areas in the Gulf. Charlie Stinson described some of the problems with offshore trawling using huge purse-seine nets. He said, "For the last part of our involvement in it, the fish was getting short in supplies. And of course, we were forced to go purse seining, which of course is probably not the best kind of fishing in the world because unless the guy was very careful with the fish wasn't, you could waste a lot of fish. If you caught too many, the boat couldn't carry. And what would they do with them? No plant would take them. They dumped them. They was dead. So, with the new canning equipment, these bigger-sized herring were now cut up, not as whole fish with docked heads and tails, but crosswise into chunks called steaks, thick enough to fit into the can. Marketed with new sauces, and the fish steaks were a useful adaptation to a changing and shorter supply of herring. In addition to these new ways of delivering fish over the seas to the factories, the Stinson Enterprises developed a busy trucking fleet which kept the supply of fish flowing steadily from various East Coast ports and among factories. This amounted to a just-in-time delivery system in the 1980s, bringing in a steady flow of imports and offshore fish supplies. Those factories for now could run longer in the year, operating almost year-round, and sometimes even 2 shifts a day. With such intense usage, this all came from the Ellsworth American coverage at the time, the Stinson plants needed still more efficiency and new highly automated equipment, much of it imported in 1987 with Norwegian technicians to keep it up to speed. And these were rollers to sort out the fish in different sizes. What's going on? There. The process was now consolidated into 4. Here's how they cut them all up, fish and tails and steaks and stuff. Fishing was now consolidated into 4 efficient plants: Prospect, Rockland, Belfast, and Bath, until Bath also closed. With the Stinson Empire now trimmed into a smoothly running machine, it was actually being set up for optimum conditions to sell it. Under the direction of the Stinson sons, Charlie as president and Calvin Jr. as treasurer and sales manager. During the 1980s, our Gouldsboro Historical Society president, B. Buckley, worked at the salebroker's office, keeping track of the steady account orders. One of these jobs was to walk over every day to the house of Calvin Sr., who had basically retired in the 1980s. And as she visited him, now in his late 90s, she was to deliver the mail of interest to him from the factory. B would always find old Calvin seated right there in that corner window. He would insist on hearing a report for the day. What kind of fish had landed? What kind was being packed today? He wasn't going to just fade away. His factory empire was sold in 1990. He died a year and a half later at age 100. The Stinson empire of 4 factories was bought for $25 million in 1990 with money from the Chemical Bank in New York and put under the primary management of Richard Klingeman, now renamed the Stinson Seafood Company, partly in recognition of the variety of seafood processed at the different plants. It was the last surviving fish cannery in the USA, its principal competitor being the Connors Brothers factories in New Brunswick. But Prospect Harbor remained the principal sardine plant, and investors under Richard Klingeman's management doubled down on faster equipment and the expedited fish supply system that the late Stinson ownership had perfected. In the factory, the trimmed herring came down at a pace faster than ever, the women packing into cans which, after cooking, were sealed and put into cases, each woman still paid by the case as she packed. Another strategy of the new ownership was to hype the marketing of sardines, which by then had faded considerably as a household food. Many of us will remember the souvenir comic book, Ricky and Debbie and Sardine Land. An effort to show the industry as a bit more glamorous, especially for visiting tourists. Many visited the factories in the 1990s, I know I did, and one of Bede Buckley's jobs was to keep records of the scheduled tours. For a similar marketing purpose, a colorful documentary film and video on fishing and plant operation was made for popular distribution in the media. And as the pressure of scarce fish and declining markets took its toll, there was a plan at the end of the 90s to expand the company to the Canadian border at Lubec. But the outcome a year later was basically a surrender to purchase by the Canadian Connor Brothers. They too were unable to find the right combination of efficient plant operation and a declining industry. And by 2004, they had merged with the Bumblebee canning operation, which operated at Prospect Harbor until 2008, when the whole configuration was sold to a British food consortium. But the whole system collapsed in another 2 years. Almost 130 employees were still working at the factory in Prospect Harbor when it closed as the last American sardine cannery in 2010. Along with lots of commemorative journalism, an extensive booklet, The End of an Era, was published that April, given to all the employees, with photos honoring the many on hand who had recently worked at the plant. Here, many of the women who worked there, I recognize a couple of my neighbors. Several had worked at the factory. Oh, not yet. Several had worked at the factory for much of their lives. The oral history interview with Charlie Stinson was done at that time, as was the video, I repeat, that you can get at Borkus Library and hear a lot of these people telling about their lives in the factory. So, has anything changed? Has anything changed? Has anything survived today as a silent witness to over 120 years of sardine canning at the Prospect Harbor plant? Well, yes. The most enduring and still operating is the private residence known as the Pink House, standing where it once was erected, at least sometime before 1890, as part of the ancient factory premises. For a long time, it had no water, no septic. It survives now as a seasonal hideaway standing in the middle of the old plant. In the 20-teens, this curiosity caught the fancy of Down East magazine, who did a Where in Maine feature about it, with the Stinson man looming in a telephoto shot over the roof. When a previous owner, Linda Grant, was renovating the interior walls one day, she was surprised to pull out a faded and water-stained sheaf of old letters, which turned out to be the office correspondence of Alfred Hamilton, builder-owner of the first sardine factory back in 1889. The Pink House was evidently the main office of the first sardine factory, sold by Calvin Stinson in 1927 with a quarter-acre plant when he was in his first effort years to raise funds. Subsequently, he regretted it. He wanted it back, but later owners had grown attached. When one of them was ready to sell, she told the new seasonal owners, "I'll sell it to you dirt cheap, provided you never sell it to Cal Stinson." And no one ever did. Just before they sold the factory in the late 1980s, in 1990, the Stinsons enacted an access agreement and an incredibly detailed circumscribed boundary around the Pink House, which remains in all the deeds today. So most of us are now more or less familiar with the post-sardine denouement, starting with the short-lived effort of Anthony Basone of Waltham, Massachusetts, to return the site to lobster packing, followed by the ownership in 2012 of the East Coast Seafood that produced the Fair Trade Lobster operation in 2014. Under this operation, concrete tanks were built to keep lobsters fresh for processing, some in frozen form. Herring has at times been landed at the factory as bait to support the local lobster fishery, while other lobsters were imported by truck to package lobster products. Both workers and feeding equipment have been imported and worker housing set up. And later, East Coast Seafood announced various plans to expand and then shifted effort elsewhere and eventually announced plans to sell to the Norwegian enterprise, the American aquaculture venture. To almost no one's regret, the outcome of that chapter has now come to nothing. But what of that enduring monument to Prospect Harbor's long years of producing America's seafood? For years in the 1960s and 70s at the Maine border, tourists were greeted by Big Jim, the sardine man. Brought here the Stinson, and then in the 1980s he became the Stinson man, brought here by Stinson's to take his station by the factory bearing the company's can emblem. And with the switch to lobster packing, it now holds a trap full of pre-cooked lobsters. And its colors are fading. We at Gouldsboro Historical Society are not the only folks who definitely hope for a better future for Big Jim. And for sure, you will be hearing more about that. And how shall we imagine a future for this rather ancient 150-year-old fish factory site? It's been part of a long and extensive effort to bring our local fishing produce to a faraway market and has witnessed cycles of local business effort and enterprise, witnessing this changes of strategy and in increments of 15 to 20 years duration. Much of the effort has been due to our local energy and resources, but much also depended on the rise and fall of national and international finance, technology, and resources from away. For now, it seems the site can be returned to control by local ownership and resources. It's even possible that the plant, as working waterfront, may no longer be a fish factory, but futures are always uncertain. The site also is a continual reminder that the produce of our surrounding sea life cannot be taken for granted, and it's in danger of being overexploited. And there's the question of rising seas. Perhaps the site can adjust to that. Perhaps a marine-related business can do well here, either in industry based on products of the sea or on repair and recondition of heavy shipping or boat building or some other maritime resource. We should keep our eyes open. In the meantime, still for all of us to see, the factory stands there, surrounding the venerable pink house, reflecting its origins, reminding us of the long 150 years heritage of this region's local energy, with its vital ties to faraway worlds and to the sea, as well as its capacity to adjust to the many inevitable changes that face us. Thank you. I wonder if anybody has actually worked in the factory or knows somebody who has anything to say about what it was like back then.
Can we see a show of hands of anybody who worked at the factory?
You did. Good man.
The only one?
What was your job?
Packing the cans in the case.
Okay. You didn't have to cut the heads and tails?
No, this was after they were packed.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Good.
4 cents a case.
How much?
4 cents a case.
4
If you
cents.
worked fast, you made $1.20 an hour.
Good old Cal, he got his money. We're working under Cal's regime, yeah. Well, any other questions at all? Otherwise, hi.
It's not a question, I'll just make a comment. Those that knew Charlie knew he was a really good runner. And he told me the story when that hurricane hit,
Yeah.
that he ran through the factory and the water was chasing him out of the factory, and that's what made him fast. He was probably around 12 years old then, I'm guessing.
He was also a pilot. And you know whether he ever flew one of those spotter planes or anything? I don't know. He didn't say anything about that. Well, it's a very nice interview of him done by the same people who did this video, which I urge anyone to see if you're interested. Okay. Yeah.
I never worked at that factory, but I worked at the Holmes Packing Company in Rockland. And it was similar setup.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll never forget as a young guy in between other things in life, I worked there for a while. And I'll never forget, there was this old woman that walked through there and would sharpen your scissors. And
Yes.
you know, and after a while, and then these ladies were flying up and down, and they won prizes for that. It made money, and I was sitting there, not cutting my thumb off. You know, a little can, and they'd be lugging the big cases out of there. And I had 4 or 5 cans in there. And then let the guys work in the retort room, the cook room, the steam room, and that was dollar money. But you know, you had to work all morning.
Hot work, yeah.
And then work in the steam room, packing. And that they paid salary for that.
Did you have tape wrapped around your fingers?
I had bandages and antibiotics.
The blood flowed.
And it was a good job for in between other things. But I always remember those women with scissors.
Some of them were really fast.
And some of the women had their own scissors.
Yeah. Treasure. Yeah. That's really.
Enviously, these old beat up ones they let you use, but they'd put them away and clean them and take them with them and stuff. They didn't leave them lying around.
Back in the 40s and 50s, a woman reputed to be the fastest in the factory was Bee Albee, the wife of the Albee's cabin.
Yeah.
That's how she was.
They had a thing during Rockland lobster days where they'd have a queen of the sardines.
Yes.
The fastest woman. They had contests, and it was envious of the women.
Brandishing their shields. Yeah.
I just have a question. I still buy Beach Cliff sardines for my husband, and I'm just wondering where are they being made?
Well, if you're looking at most of them, and carefully, it will say made in Poland or made in, they still have the brand for a while.
Those
But,
are Morocco.
the brand is still there, but they're mostly fished in the Baltic and the North Sea.
The back of BLB could make $18 an hour. And that was big money in those days.
That says volumes about her speed. Yeah, absolutely. Considering how little you made, yeah. All right. Okay, and just for that, thank you all.
Thank you very much.